The moment the waitress touched the piano, the laughter in the ballroom slowly died, because within seconds it became clear that something extraordinary was about to happen. The Whitmore Grand Ballroom glittered like a palace suspended above the city, 30 floors up where the skyline stretched for miles beyond the glass walls, and beneath chandeliers the size of small cars. 200 guests in tuxedos and evening gowns moved through the charity gala with the quiet confidence of people who had never worried about the price of anything in their lives. Crystal glasses chimed softly against one another. Waiters in pressed uniforms carried silver trays through the crowd, and a polished black Steinway concert piano sat on the small stage like a silent monument to elegance, mostly decorative, rarely touched, a symbol of culture more than music. Among the servers weaving carefully between tables was Emily Carter, 22 years old, wearing a simple black uniform and comfortable shoes chosen not for style, but for surviving a 10-hour shift on marble floors. Her blonde hair tied back neatly as she balanced a tray of sparkling water and wine flutes, moving quietly through conversations about investments, charity boards, and vacation homes on the coast. To the guests, she was almost invisible, just another part of the evening's machinery, but every time she passed the stage her eyes flickered, almost instinctively, toward the piano. It was a small glance, barely noticeable, but it carried something deeper than curiosity, something like memory. Her father had once told her that a good piano never truly goes silent, that even when the room is quiet it is waiting, listening for the right hands. That was years ago, back when their apartment still had a worn upright piano pushed against the wall of the living room, before hospital bills replaced music in the house, and before Emily traded practice hours for late shifts and tips that paid for groceries. Tonight she had come to work, nothing more, nothing less. And yet the piano sat there under the soft gold light like a door to a life she had carefully locked away. At one of the larger tables near the stage, a group of younger millionaires had grown louder as the evening went on, their laughter fueled by expensive whiskey and the easy bravado of success that had never truly been tested. One of them noticed Emily pausing for half a second near the stage while setting down a glass, and with a grin he leaned back in his chair and called out across the room with playful arrogance, asking the waitress if she knew how to play that beautiful piano or if it was just something she stared at during her shift. A few nearby guests chuckled, assuming it was a harmless joke, the kind that floats through rooms like this without consequence. Emily froze for a brief moment, tray still in her hands, and the attention of the table turned toward her with curiosity that was not quite kind. Another voice joined in, suggesting that if the waitress wanted to try, maybe she could entertain them for a minute, because after all a charity gala could always use a little unexpected talent. The laughter spread lightly across the nearby tables, not cruel but dismissive, the sound of people certain they already understood the ending of the story. Emily slowly set the tray down on an empty table beside the stage, her hands steady even though her heart had begun to beat faster, and for a moment she simply looked at the piano again, the polished black surface reflecting the golden lights above like calm water. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore, the quiet billionaire hosting the event, noticed the small shift in the air, the subtle way the laughter softened as the waitress stepped toward the stage, and he leaned slightly forward in his chair with the faintest hint of curiosity, because something about the calm determination in her eyes did not match the joke everyone else believed they were watching. The room did not erupt into applause or cheers the way stories usually claim, because the truth was quieter and far more powerful, the kind of silence that spreads slowly when people begin to realize they might have misjudged someone completely. Emily Carter stepped closer to the stage with measured calm, her shoes making soft echoes against the polished marble floor as the soft murmur of conversation around the ballroom faded into a curious hush. A few guests still smiled politely, assuming this was simply a harmless moment of entertainment arranged by the host, but others leaned slightly forward in their seats with puzzled expressions, trying to understand why a waitress who had been serving water only seconds earlier now walked toward a concert. Grand piano worth more than most people's homes. The Steinway reflected the warm chandelier light like a black mirror, and for a moment Emily simply stood beside it, her hand resting gently against the smooth polished lid as if greeting an old friend she had not seen in years. She could hear the faint clink of silverware somewhere across the room and the distant hum of the city far below the windows. But everything else seemed to blur into the background, including the curious stares of 200 guests who had expected a joke and were now watching something far less predictable unfold. Daniel Whitmore remained seated near the center of the ballroom, his posture relaxed but attentive, the way a man observes the early moments of a situation before deciding what it might become. And although he said nothing, his eyes followed Emily with a level of focus that had built an empire over 4 decades. Around him, the younger investors who had started the teasing exchange were still amused, though the laughter had softened into playful curiosity, as if they were waiting for the brief, awkward moment when the waitress might tap a few keys, laugh nervously, and return to her shift. Emily lowered herself slowly onto the piano bench, adjusting its position with quiet familiarity that almost no one noticed except Daniel Whitmore, whose brow lifted slightly at the subtle confidence of the movement. The bench creaked softly beneath her as she settled into place, and for the first time she allowed her fingers to hover just above the ivory keys, not touching them yet, simply remembering the shape of the instrument beneath her hands. The memory came back instantly. The countless evenings in a small apartment where an aging upright piano had filled the room with sound, while her father corrected her posture and reminded her that music was never about showing off, but about listening closely enough to hear the story hidden inside every note. Those lessons had ended years earlier when life changed directions, when the piano was sold to cover hospital bills and the apartment grew quieter than either of them had imagined possible. Emily inhaled slowly, the steady breath of someone stepping across a line between past and present, and then at last her fingers rested lightly on the keys. Across the ballroom, a server paused beside a table with a tray of champagne flutes, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward slightly, elbows resting against the table as he watched the young waitress at the piano with increasing interest, because the calm patience in her posture suggested this was not an impulsive joke, but something practiced, something deeply familiar. The room held its breath without realizing it had done so, and then the first note sounded, a single deep chord that rolled through the ballroom with rich resonance, vibrating gently against crystal glasses and marble columns as the sound spread outward like ripples across still water, and in that moment the smiles around the room began to fade as curiosity quietly transformed into astonishment. The second chord followed the first with quiet confidence, and the room that had expected a quick joke now felt the unmistakable weight of real music unfolding in front of them. Emily Carter did not rush the notes, allowing each one to settle into the vast ballroom before moving to the next, her fingers traveling across the keys with a calm precision that came from years of practice long before she ever carried a serving tray. The deep resonance of the Steinway filled the air beneath the chandeliers, echoing softly against marble columns and tall glass windows that looked out over miles of city lights. At first a few guests still exchanged amused glances, but that changed quickly as the melody grew richer and more complex, rising and falling with the emotional depth of a piece that demanded both skill and understanding. One of the younger investors who had started the teasing moment earlier leaned back in his chair with a puzzled expression, the grin slowly fading from his face as he realized that what he was hearing was not a casual attempt from a curious waitress, but a disciplined performance that belonged on a concert stage. A woman seated beside him lowered her wine glass halfway to the table, suddenly more interested in the piano than the conversation she had been having seconds earlier. Across the ballroom, a group of guests who had been discussing real estate quietly turned their chairs toward the stage, drawn by the powerful clarity of the music. The transformation of the atmosphere happened gradually, like the slow dimming of lights before a theater performance, until the room that had once been full of scattered conversations now held a collective silence broken only by the sound of Emily's playing. Daniel Whitmore felt the shift before most of the others did, because he had spent a lifetime observing small changes that others overlooked. His eyes remained fixed on Emily's hands as they moved across the keys with remarkable control, and something in the phrasing of the melody stirred a memory deep in his mind. It was not only the technical precision that caught his attention, but the emotion behind it, the quiet confidence of someone who understood the music beyond the notes themselves. He remembered hearing that same piece many years earlier in a very different room, a private evening where his father had played piano while guests sat nearby listening with quiet respect. The memory returned slowly, carried through the ballroom by the familiar rise and fall of the melody. Meanwhile, Emily felt the weight of the room's attention without allowing it to break her concentration. Her world had narrowed to the 88 keys beneath her fingers and the rhythm that guided every movement of her hands. The ballroom, the guests, the whisper of silk dresses and polished shoes all faded into the background as she followed the structure of the music the way her father had taught her long ago. He used to say that the first few measures of a piece tell you whether a musician is nervous or confident, but the middle reveals the truth about who they really are. Now those lessons lived quietly inside her hands as she played, each phrase flowing into the next with growing intensity. The melody deepened, rising into a powerful passage that filled the entire room with rich sound, and for the first time several guests leaned forward in their seats with genuine fascination. One man, near the back of the ballroom, whispered softly to the woman beside him, asking how long the hotel had been hiding such a talented pianist among their staff. Daniel Whitmore did not answer the question forming in his own mind, but he felt the growing certainty that the young woman seated at the piano was not simply revealing a skill tonight. She was revealing a story, one that none of the people in that glittering room had expected to hear. The music did not fade the way casual entertainment usually does at a social gathering, because by now the entire ballroom had begun to understand that this moment had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful than anyone expected. Emily Carter's hands continued to move with steady grace across the polished keys, the melody rising and flowing through the enormous space like a living presence that gently replaced the earlier laughter. Guests who had once spoken over one another now sat almost completely still, their attention pulled toward the stage by the emotional weight carried in every note. The chandeliers above reflected softly against the glossy black surface of the Steinway piano, and the city lights beyond the tall windows shimmered like distant stars while the music filled the room with a deep and thoughtful calm. At several tables, people exchanged quiet glances, the kind that communicate surprise without needing words, because the young waitress who had entered the evening as part of the background now held the attention of everyone in the building. One elderly guest slowly set his fork down on his plate and leaned forward with a thoughtful expression, recognizing the complexity of the piece being performed. A woman seated beside him whispered that the music sounded like something she had once heard in a concert hall in New York City, and the man nodded gently without taking his eyes off the stage. Meanwhile, Daniel Whitmore remained completely focused on Emily, the subtle lines on his face reflecting a mixture of curiosity and recognition. As the melody continued to unfold, he began to hear details that others in the room might not fully notice. Small interpretive choices in tempo and emphasis that suggested the pianist had not only practiced the piece, but truly lived with it. Those choices reminded him strongly of someone he had known long ago, a musician whose style had once carried the same quiet strength and emotional depth. The realization stirred another memory that rose slowly through his thoughts, bringing back an image of a modest apartment years earlier where music had filled the evening air, while conversations about discipline and passion drifted through the room. At the piano, Emily allowed the music to build gradually, the earlier gentle phrases giving way to a powerful section that required both speed and control. Her fingers moved with increasing energy, yet never lost their precision, each note connecting seamlessly to the next, as if the instrument itself were guiding her hands. The ballroom seemed to shrink around the performance, its vast luxury temporarily overshadowed by the intensity of the sound. Even the servers who had continued working quietly around the edges of the room had now paused near the walls, watching with open admiration as the young woman, who usually carried trays, revealed a mastery that no one had expected to see. One of the younger investors who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier amusement replaced by genuine respect as he realized that the moment had grown far beyond the casual joke he had intended. The music swelled into a dramatic passage that rolled through the room with the power of a rising tide, and as Emily pressed deeper into the piece, she felt the familiar connection that had once defined her life. It was the same connection her father had described when he told her that real music does not exist to impress people, but to remind them of feelings they forgot they carried. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore finally understood what had captured his attention from the very beginning. Because the style of the performance carried echoes of a name he had not spoken in many years, and the possibility forming quietly in his mind made him watch the young pianist even more closely as the music moved toward its next breathtaking movement. The music continued to unfold like a story that had waited years to be told, each passage flowing into the next with growing confidence, as Emily Carter allowed the full power of the piece to emerge through the Steinway beneath her hands. The deep resonance of the instrument rolled through the ballroom in rich waves of sound, and by now the earlier surprise among the guests had transformed into genuine fascination. Conversations had completely disappeared, replaced by a stillness that seemed almost sacred beneath the crystal chandeliers. The city skyline beyond the windows shimmered quietly in the distance, but inside the grand ballroom, every eye remained fixed on the young woman at the piano. Emily no longer noticed the audience watching her. The rhythm of the music had pulled her fully into a familiar world she had once known every day. Her fingers moved with increasing clarity across the 88 keys, shifting from powerful chords to delicate phrases that carried both strength and tenderness. She could almost hear her father's voice again, calm and steady, in their old apartment, reminding her that music was never about proving anything to the people listening, but about telling the truth hidden inside every note. That memory filled her mind as the melody turned toward a more emotional passage, and the sincerity in her playing deepened in a way that made the entire room feel it. Daniel Whitmore recognized that shift immediately. The familiarity that had been forming quietly in his thoughts now sharpened into a clearer realization. The phrasing, the gentle hesitation before certain transitions, the way the melody breathed between strong chords and softer reflections, all of it reminded him unmistakably of a pianist he had once admired deeply. Many years earlier, long before his company had grown into the massive enterprise it was today, Daniel had attended a small charity recital hosted by a musician named Jonathan Carter. The performance had taken place in a modest hall with worn velvet seats and warm lighting, but the music had been extraordinary. Jonathan Carter had played with a sincerity that moved the audience in ways that technical brilliance alone never could. Daniel remembered leaving that evening with a quiet sense that he had witnessed something rare, the kind of artistry that appears only when talent and honesty meet in the same place. Yet Jonathan Carter's name had slowly faded from the concert programs over the years as life moved forward and new musicians took the stage. Now, sitting in the Whitmore Grand Ballroom decades later, Daniel felt the unmistakable echo of that same musical voice returning through the hands of the young waitress seated at the Steinway. His eyes narrowed slightly in thoughtful concentration as the realization formed more clearly in his mind. The last name Carter repeated itself silently in his thoughts. Could it be possible that the young woman playing with such emotional depth carried a connection to the pianist he remembered so vividly? Meanwhile, Emily guided the piece into one of its most demanding sections, her hands crossing the keyboard with swift precision as the music surged with renewed energy. The sound filled the ballroom with a powerful brilliance that left many of the guests sitting forward in their chairs with open admiration. Even the group of investors who had laughed earlier now watched quietly, their earlier amusement replaced by genuine respect. As the final movement of the piece approached, Emily felt a calm determination settle over her, the same determination that had once carried her through endless hours of practice beside her father. Every note now carried a sense of purpose, building steadily toward a conclusion that would leave no doubt about the truth hidden behind her quiet presence. And as Daniel Whitmore continued to observe her with growing certainty, he realized that the story unfolding on the stage was no longer just about an unexpected performance at a charity gala. It was about a legacy that had quietly returned to life in the most unexpected place. The final movement of the music approached with a quiet inevitability, the kind that makes every listener lean forward without realizing they have done so, because the melody now carried a sense of arrival. Emily Carter's fingers traveled swiftly across the keys with a precision that felt both disciplined and natural, the sound of the Steinway filling the Whitmore Grand Ballroom with a powerful clarity that resonated beneath the towering chandeliers. Every note now carried the accumulated emotion of the entire piece, rising and falling with confident momentum as the performance reached its most demanding passages. The guests who only minutes earlier had been discussing investment portfolios and vacation homes now sat motionless in their chairs, their full attention captured by the unexpected brilliance unfolding before them. The rich tones of the piano rolled across the marble floor and reflected softly against the glass walls overlooking the city, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a charity gala and more like a private concert hall suspended high above the lights of downtown. Emily felt the rhythm guiding her completely now, her hands moving with the steady assurance of someone returning to a language she had never truly forgotten. The years that had separated her from the instrument seemed to dissolve within the music itself, and every phrase flowed naturally into the next as though the piano had been waiting patiently for this moment. She remembered the countless evenings when her father had gently corrected the shape of her hands and reminded her that confidence in music does not come from applause, but from honesty. Those words echoed quietly within her thoughts as she approached the final sequence of the piece, a passage that demanded both speed and control while maintaining the emotional depth that had carried the entire performance. Across the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore watched with growing certainty, his earlier suspicions now forming into a clear realization that left him momentarily stunned. The style of the performance was no coincidence. The phrasing and emotional balance were unmistakably connected to the musician he had admired years ago. Jonathan Carter had played with the same thoughtful restraint, allowing the music to breathe naturally instead of forcing it into dramatic display. Daniel leaned slightly forward in his chair, his expression reflecting both surprise and respect as he studied the young pianist with renewed attention. The possibility that had begun forming in his mind now seemed almost undeniable. The young waitress seated at the Steinway was not merely a talented employee who happened to know a difficult piece of music. She was carrying forward a musical voice that had once left a lasting impression on him decades earlier. Meanwhile, the music surged toward its conclusion with graceful intensity. Emily's fingers crossed the keyboard in swift movements as the melody built toward its final statement, each chord ringing through the room with remarkable clarity. A quiet tension spread through the audience as the performance approached its closing moments, the kind of tension that exists only when listeners know they are witnessing something rare. Even the younger investors who had started the teasing earlier now sat in complete silence, their expressions reflecting the humility that comes when assumptions quietly dissolve. The final passage rose with confident energy before resolving into a series of deep resonant chords that seemed to settle gently across the entire ballroom. Emily held the last note just long enough for the sound to bloom fully beneath the chandeliers before allowing her hands to rest softly above the keys. The music faded slowly into silence, leaving the room suspended in a moment of astonished stillness. For several seconds no one moved or spoke. Daniel Whitmore remained seated with his eyes fixed on the young woman at the piano, and as the final vibration of the instrument disappeared into the quiet air, he understood that the evening had just revealed something far more meaningful than anyone in that room had expected. For a few seconds after the final note faded into silence, the Whitmore Grand Ballroom remained completely still, as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. 200 guests sat frozen beneath the chandeliers, their eyes fixed on the young woman at the piano, who only minutes earlier had been carrying trays between tables. The silence was not awkward or uncertain. It was the kind of silence that appears when people are trying to process something that has quietly rewritten their expectations. Emily Carter slowly lifted her hands from the keys and rested them gently in her lap, her posture calm, but her heart beating faster now that the music had ended and the attention of the entire room returned all at once. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her, yet she remained seated for a moment longer, letting the last traces of the performance settle into the quiet air. The polished surface of the Steinway reflected the golden chandelier light, and for the first time since she began playing, Emily allowed herself to look out across the ballroom. The expressions she saw were nothing like the amused smiles from earlier. Faces that had once carried casual curiosity now reflected something closer to admiration, and in some cases quiet disbelief. At one of the tables near the stage, the young investors who had started the teasing exchange sat motionless, their confident expressions replaced by the humbled awareness that they had misjudged the situation completely. One of them slowly shook his head with a soft laugh of astonishment, as if trying to reconcile the image of a waitress with the performance they had just witnessed. Then the stillness broke. It began with a single pair of hands clapping slowly from the center of the ballroom. Daniel Whitmore had risen from his chair, his expression calm but deeply impressed as he applauded with steady respect. The sound of his hands echoed through the room, and within seconds the rest of the guests followed. Applause spread across the ballroom in a powerful wave, filling the enormous space with recognition that felt sincere rather than polite. The applause grew louder as people stood from their chairs one by one, creating a standing ovation that Emily had never expected to hear in a room like this. Servers near the walls joined in with quiet smiles, and several guests exchanged astonished remarks about the extraordinary performance they had just experienced. Emily stood slowly from the piano bench, unsure how to react to the overwhelming response, her hands instinctively brushing the sides of her uniform, as if reminding herself that she was still the same person who had begun the evening. Serving water. The applause continued, and as she glanced toward the center of the ballroom, she saw Daniel Whitmore walking calmly toward the stage. His presence carried the quiet authority of someone who had built a lifetime of success, yet his expression held none of the distance that often surrounded powerful figures. Instead, there was curiosity in his eyes and a thoughtful respect that made several guests lean closer to hear what he might say. When he reached the stage, he paused for a moment, looking at Emily with the kind of attention reserved for someone whose story has suddenly become important. The applause gradually softened into an attentive silence as the billionaire host stood beside the piano, and after a brief moment Daniel Whitmore spoke in a calm voice that carried clearly through the ballroom. He asked Emily Carter a simple question that instantly captured the curiosity of every person in the room. He asked whether her father had once been a pianist named Jonathan Carter. And the moment the name was spoken, a quiet ripple of surprise passed through the audience because the evening that had begun as a casual charity event was now revealing a connection no one had expected. The question hung gently in the air beneath the crystal chandeliers, and for a moment the vast Whitmore Grand Ballroom seemed to shrink around that single name. Jonathan Carter. Emily Carter felt a quiet wave of surprise move through her chest as she looked at Daniel Whitmore standing beside the piano. The room had grown completely silent again, not the stunned silence from the music, but a deeper curiosity that spread through the audience as they waited to hear her answer. Emily nodded slowly, her voice calm but filled with emotion as she spoke clearly enough for those closest to hear. Yes, she said softly, Jonathan Carter was her father. A quiet murmur moved through the ballroom like a ripple across still water. Several older guests exchanged glances of recognition, because the name carried memories for those who had followed music closely years earlier. Daniel Whitmore's expression softened as the confirmation settled in. For a moment he simply nodded, as if acknowledging a truth he had already begun to suspect during the performance. He explained to the room that many years ago he had attended a small recital where Jonathan Carter had performed with remarkable sincerity and skill. The memory had remained with him for decades. Not because the concert hall had been grand or the audience particularly famous, but because the music had been honest in a way that stayed with those who heard it. Daniel looked back at Emily with quiet respect as he spoke, explaining that the phrasing and emotional depth in her playing carried the unmistakable echo of the same musician he had admired long ago. The audience listened closely, some with growing fascination as the unexpected connection unfolded. Emily felt the warmth of the moment settle around her, though the attention still felt unfamiliar after years spent blending quietly into the background of other people's evenings. She explained that her father had taught her to play when she was very young, practicing together in their small apartment every evening after dinner. For many years music had been the center of their lives, but when illness entered their home, everything changed. The piano was eventually sold to cover medical bills, and the long hours of practice slowly gave way to jobs that helped keep the household running. Emily said this simply and without bitterness, the way someone speaks about a chapter that shaped them but did not define them completely. Daniel Whitmore listened carefully, his expression thoughtful as he considered the journey that had brought the young woman from those quiet evenings of practice to a serving shift at his own charity gala. Around the room, guests exchanged quiet comments about the remarkable turn the evening had taken, and many of them now looked at Emily not as a waitress, but as a musician whose talent had been hidden behind circumstances few people in that room had ever faced. Daniel finally turned toward the audience and spoke again with calm clarity. He said that sometimes extraordinary talent appears in places where the world has simply forgotten to look, and tonight the room had been fortunate enough to witness such a moment. Then he looked back at Emily and made an offer that immediately captured the attention of everyone present. He said that if she wished to continue her musical journey, he would personally ensure that she had every opportunity to study, practice, and perform again on the kind of stages her father would have been proud to see. The words settled across the ballroom with quiet power, and for the second time that evening the guests found themselves witnessing something far more meaningful than they had expected when they first arrived beneath the golden lights. For a long moment after Daniel Whitmore finished speaking, the grand ballroom remained suspended in a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred, as if every person present understood they were witnessing the turning point of a story that none of them had expected to unfold that evening. Emily Carter stood beside the Steinway piano beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, her mind still processing the words that had just been spoken. Only an hour earlier she had entered the ballroom carrying trays and moving carefully between tables, hoping simply to complete her shift without drawing attention. Now 200 guests watched her with admiration instead of passing glances, and the man who owned the building itself had just offered to open a door she had believed was closed forever. Emily took a slow breath before answering, her voice steady even though the moment carried more emotion than she had felt in years. She thanked Daniel Whitmore sincerely and explained that music had never truly left her heart, even during the years when life required her to focus on work and responsibility instead of practice. She said her father had always believed that music was not something a person owns, but something a person carries with them, quietly waiting for the moment it is needed again. Daniel listened carefully, nodding with thoughtful respect as the audience absorbed her words. The room that had once been filled with polite conversation about charity and business now felt transformed into something more meaningful, a gathering of people witnessing the quiet return of a dream that had almost been forgotten. Daniel Whitmore spoke again, his voice calm but filled with conviction as he explained that talent deserves opportunity regardless of where it is discovered. He told Emily that the offer was genuine and that arrangements could be made for professional training, access to instruments, and the guidance of instructors who could help her rebuild the musical future that circumstances had interrupted. The guests listened closely, many of them smiling as they realized the evening had become more than a charity gala. It had become a reminder that remarkable ability often hides in places the world forgets to notice. Emily looked across the ballroom at the many faces watching her, and for the first time she felt something she had not felt since childhood practice sessions beside her father's old piano. It was not nervousness or disbelief. It was hope. She accepted the opportunity with quiet gratitude, her words simple but sincere as she promised that if given the chance, she would honor both the generosity being offered and the lessons her father had taught her many years earlier. The audience responded with another wave of applause, though this time it carried a deeper warmth than the first. The applause was not only for the performance they had heard, but for the possibility that had just been created. Daniel Whitmore smiled gently and stepped aside as the room continued to celebrate the unexpected moment that had transformed the evening. Far beyond the tall windows, the city lights shimmered across the night skyline. But inside the Whitmore Grand Ballroom, something far brighter had quietly taken shape. A story that began with laughter at a waitress stepping toward a piano had ended with the rediscovery of talent, legacy, and opportunity. And as the guests slowly returned to their conversations, many of them carried away a simple realization that would stay with them long after the music had faded. True ability does not belong to titles, uniforms, or wealth. It reveals itself through courage, through dedication, and through the quiet determination of someone who refuses to let their gift disappear.